Welcome to the Kofu Mama Show. Today we have a very special guest. We have Melissa Lowry. She's an education coach, and she has also been in the field of education for over 20 years as a teacher, curriculum director, and now principal of a school that teaches ages 5 to 15. Hi, Melissa. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so excited to talk to you today. You have such a wealth of information. And also, you're a co-author of a book called Answer Keys,
Yes.
Teacher Lesson Plans for Effective Parenting. So we have so much to talk about today. I kind of wanted to start on something more general and something more for our listeners about our child's developmental age and what stage they're in. So what are the developmental stages going from, say, infant until 10 years old that we want to look at?
Yes.
I want to hone into.
That is a great question. And I would say basically from birth through about 5 or 6 years old, your child is going to go through a developmental sort of stage about every 6 months. And so this is why you might have an 18-month-old that is delightful. And then at 2 years old, the only word that your child will say is no. And so here in the United States, they often call that the terrible twos. And the reason for that is when it comes to brain development, right about 2 to 2.5, our children begin to understand that they're separate from us. And up until about age 2, they don't really realize that their identity is completely separate from their parents' identity.
Oh.
And so once they hit that stage, they are trying to exhibit their dominance and their independence, which is why the answer to almost everything is no. And so it's typical for those 2 to 2.5-year-olds to want to run away from you, but then they're always sort of looking over their shoulder because they are going through kind of a physical separation from you where they're really starting to realize that they're independent. And even to back up a little bit, probably around 9 months old, children will develop something called object permanency. And what that means is up until about 9 months old, when a parent leaves the room or a caregiver, the child doesn't think about that person again. They leave the room and they're gone. Right around 9 months old is where children will really begin to cry when a caregiver, a babysitter, a parent leaves the room, like when they go down for a nap and they become clingy. And that's because object permanency, they all of a sudden realize that if a ball rolls away from them and goes under a couch, that ball still exists. Up until about 9 months old, the ball rolls under the couch, they forget about it. And so they haven't developed object permanency yet. And so that's sort of kind of two maybe important developmental stages, 9 months and about 2 years old. The other thing too is for the parents out there that are very frustrated and wondering why their toddler does not want to share. Well, they're not programmed to share. And until a child reaches no less than 24 months, but usually closer to 36, there should be like no expectation they can share. And that doesn't mean you don't teach it. That doesn't mean you don't model that and say, oh, we should be sharing. But when we talk about expectations, most little kids are just very selfish, and that's what they do until about 3 years old or so. And then that's when they can start actually having a reciprocal relationship. So even up till about 3 to 4 years old, children will do something called parallel play. So you'll have two little kids who will play next to each other, but they're really not playing with each other. And it's really not until about age 3 to 4 that they will actually start to have reciprocal play and reciprocal actions. And that's when it starts to clue in that sharing is actually an effective way to communicate and an effective way for kids to form those bonds and those friendships with their peers. So those bonds and friendships really don't start to develop until about that pre-K in the United States. Pre-kindergarten is about 4 years old or so. And that's when you see kids get better at the sharing, taking turns, being able to wait a little bit for something. That really doesn't click until about 4 or 5, when they get to the age where from brain development, they understand those relationships and how they work. So, and then when they, oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
I was just curious about, so they're not programmed to share from when they're at a young age.
No. We are not programmed to share. That's something that's really taught. Now, that doesn't mean that when a child gets older, if it's not directly modeled, a child wouldn't give something to someone else or wouldn't share. But it's definitely behavior that from a young age, if parents are looking for, let's say, bang for their parenting buck, I would say that starting to model that behavior of sharing one another could start as early as a few months old. It's just the expectation that the child's going to be able to do that independently shouldn't
Right.
really happen until somewhere between like 3 to 6 years old. And it's going to be a progression from about 3 to 6. And then when we see kids get into grade school, so maybe first grade, kindergarten, first grade, then sharing is usually pretty easy. That doesn't mean that they won't be territorial about certain toys or things, but that's where you could have an expectation that your child would really be able to share.
I see.
Yeah.
Actually, I have a question about, so how does that translate to actually going to school? So when a child is starting to share and then starting to understand about relationships and stuff, how does it translate when they're given in an entire classroom situation?
So a lot of times not very well in the beginning
Hmm.
because you get a whole bunch of little kids who are very self-centered, and that's the age and the stage, and you put them into a room where all of a sudden, there's only 4 balls and there's 20 kids, and it is where it has to be taught and modeled. And that's where parents and caregivers and teachers have to have a lot of patience, because it's not something that you can show or model once and all of a sudden it clicks. It's going to take usually a good 3, 6 months, almost, it could take a full year of school for a child to really get into that habit and that routine of being able to sort of give of themselves and share.
What are some things that parents can do to help teachers um, have their kids, be able to adapt to a kindergarten environment?
Right. That is a really, really great question, because a lot of times and I did teach kindergarten and first grade and early childhood, and parents will always say, like, how do I set up my child to be successful in the school environment? And sometimes I think parents feel that it should be academic, and they're asking
Hmm.
a lot about academic skills, when for those of us that have been in the teaching profession, it's really those soft skills. Sometimes they're called executive function, things like that, are actually better predictors of school success later on. In fact, the number one predictor of health, wealth, and just like general well being in children, they've done some great studies on this, is self control. And
Mm.
that is the single best predictor of how a child will do in adulthood, is the ability to control oneself. And that's something that's really hard at a young age and does have to be taught. And so what I tell parents all the time is some of the best things that they can do for their younger children, let's say from the ages like 3 to 6, is delayed gratification. Not allowing your child to have everything that he or she wants, and starting to model that sometimes when we want something, we have to wait for it. We have to earn it. We have to take a turn. We
Hmm.
have to be able to sit quietly. It's those soft skills that actually help children in school be more successful. It's actually easier to teach a lot of the early academics than it is to have a child come into school who's not used to being socialized with other children. That's actually harder to do with them sometimes than the academics are. So
Hmm.
parents really could work with their children on, starting to share, being able to sit, being able to entertain themselves. That's another big one, is parents today want to hand their kids a device or a computer or an iPad to entertain them, when really what we'd like to see in school is kids who are able to entertain themselves. And one of the
Hmm.
best ways to do that is through books. Even if they're just picture books that don't have any words in them, giving children an opportunity to develop their minds through their imaginations and not just being fed that information, let's say from an app or a computer game. Not that those can't be fun in moderation, but
Hmm.
really giving them authentic experiences that help them to kind of see themselves as part of the bigger world. And sometimes when we're focused all the time on an iPad or an app, we're not seeing all the wonderful things that are going on around us. And we learn so much from those things. That's where you're learning those soft skills.
Do you find that it's changed over the years? Like the kids coming in, is they have changed a lot in terms of there's so much technology around. There's much less book reading and all that stuff. So when you get to a school environment and you see these kids coming into your kindergartens, it's very different, isn't it?
I definitely have heard, and this is more, anecdotal. There are some studies that go along with this, but definitely my friends that are working in early childhood and in occupational therapy are definitely seeing some trends that are concerning from the standpoint that our kids are a lot more sedentary than they had been in past years. They're not running around as much. They're sitting in front of screens. COVID-19 hasn't helped with that in some ways. In other ways, it has. Children are out playing a little bit more than maybe they did before the pandemic, at least here where I live in Atlanta, Georgia, a lot more kids riding bikes around and stuff. But in general, what we're seeing is our children are coming to school not having developed some of those soft skills where we used to see those maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago. And that is a little bit concerning. Our children are much more likely to spend time on screens than they are to spend time out in nature, in the outdoors, or exploring. And I think sometimes parents think that idle time is like ill used, when idle time is sort of, well, what they say is boredom is the engine of creativity. It's when we have an opportunity to be with our thoughts that we have an opportunity to slow down and really think about how to extend ourselves. And our children actually really need that time. So the idea of lying on the front lawn and watching the clouds and making shapes out of them and things like that, those are actually really important experiences for children as they develop, more so than having kind of constant instant gratification and constant stimuli hitting us all the time. It's nice for the brain to sort of slow down a little bit and just sort of enjoy itself and enjoy everything that's around us. And I think parents underestimate the value of that.
You are totally right. I totally believe that. I can see how, you're always trying to push them to look at this book or that book or this toy or this thing. Develop your skills by putting things together, doing all sorts of things, but nobody thinks about that. I thought that that's really important. Nobody thinks about that. That's amazing.
Yes, we think that busy equals effective or that busy equals positive, and that's not necessarily true.
That's totally, I love that. So can you tell us more about, this COVID situation, how can parents positively impact their remote learning or distance experience? Because I know you have some expertise in that.
Yes, so I did spend the greater part of the last year actually running a micro school out of my house for children who couldn't go to school during the pandemic. And so they were learning with me virtually. And it was really interesting to see the students I had. It was fortunate because we had a cohort. And so they had that socialization that's super important that many kids have missed during COVID-19. But what I'd say, a few things for parents, I jotted down a few notes when I was thinking about this. The first is for parents to take a little bit of pressure off of themselves. I went to school for 7 years to become a really good teacher, and then I taught for a really long time. And even today, I've been doing this 20-something years. There are days that I teach a lesson and it doesn't go as well as I would have liked. And then there are other days I teach something and I hit it out of the park, right? And so I think parents need to understand that they aren't teachers, and that this idea of them being able to turn on a dime in a pandemic when they might have had concerns about their own jobs or their own family's health and all that's going on, that is a very difficult process. And so having a certain level of forgiveness of oneself and a certain level of grace to say as a parent, okay, this might not be what I'm going to be the best at. That's the first step. Many parents were just so afraid and weren't even breathing because they were just so concerned to just get things done and do this and do that, that they weren't giving themselves enough grace to just say, it's okay to say you're not the best at something. I've been a teacher a long time, and I had 2 children home during the pandemic, and there were days when I wasn't at my best either, and this is what I do for a living. So the first thing is to just breathe and to just forgive yourself and to give yourself a break that this is a difficult and uncertain time. all over the world, not just in one country. I think the second is to allow your children an opportunity to be frustrated and upset, but to not allow them to wallow in it. So there's a difference between saying, okay, the situation I'm in is really unfortunate right now, and I'm separated from my friends, and I'm having to learn online. It's not the easiest. Of recognizing the hardship and the adversity in that, there's a difference in allowing that hardship and adversity to take over for us. So our children do at the same time have to say to themselves, okay, I have a task at hand here and I need to take responsibility for that. And so I think that parents can't underestimate the value of having expectations for their children. So it is helping your child set up a routine, making sure that they're engaging in the same behaviors every day so that they're waking up on time, that they are brushing their teeth, getting ready for school, even if it's over a computer. We all do really well with rituals, and we all do really well with habits. And if we all had to wake up every morning and had no idea what we were doing and where we were going, we'd all be discombobulated. And our children are the same way. So establishing a consistent routine for them is going to make them feel less anxiety and less stressed out. And that seems counterintuitive because parents say, well, that you're expecting them to do the same thing every day. And yes, and actually the more they engage in that behavior, the better that they will feel. So it's having a consistent routine, but being realistic about the fact that we are not, not everybody is a teacher, right, and that you have to have a certain amount of forgiveness for that. I think that it's also helping children to be proactive, that when they don't understand something, that they are reaching out to the teacher, or that if your children are young, you are reaching out to the teacher. I think there are a lot of parents who don't want to burden the teacher. They're afraid to ask a question. But as a teacher, unless somebody tells me they don't understand something, or unless a parent reaches out and says, you know what, that might be too much homework, or my child is struggling with this, I won't necessarily know that. And so it's opening up those lines of communication with the teacher, I think, is super important as well. And then I think it's also getting help. There's nothing wrong with talking to some friends in the neighborhood and saying, okay, who's good at what? And do we have one parent that might be better at math than another, and another parent who is a literature teacher or understands literature, and putting together small cohorts. And we saw that a lot through the pandemic. We called them pods, where we had families who were either distancing together, where they were only seeing certain families so they knew that they weren't going to contract the virus from one another, and they kind of pooled their resources. I think also looking for resources online is also a very good thing to do, but then it's also turning it off. Our children are involved in far more technology than ever before because of the pandemic, which means they need a break more than ever. They need to go outside and play. Yeah. They need to turn their brains off. They need to read a book. They need to actually write on paper. They need to enjoy art and the things that allow their brain to disengage. And there's been plenty of research on blue light and many things with technology that tell us that our brains need about an hour to 2 hours to relax from technology before we can really sleep and get that good sleep. And our kids are no different. So if they're up on that technology until right before they go to bed, they're not going to have that quality sleep. And sleep deprivation is a huge pervasive issue with our young people. Adolescents need anywhere from 8 to 12 hours of sleep, depending on their age. And a lot of times sleep deprivation will mimic things like ADHD. And so parents will freak out and think their child might have an attention issue when it's driven by lack of sleep or not quality sleep. So even though our kids are on the computer a lot more for distance learning, remote learning, they also need to have ample time to be off of those devices as well.
And what happens if you happen to have a teacher that you don't like? How do you deal with this situation?
So I think it's a couple things. So are you talking about the parent not liking the teacher or the child not liking the teacher?
Actually, the child not liking the teacher, I think is more important there.
We'll start with that one. So, one of the reasons why I actually became a teacher was because I had a really horrible one who really, really, really kind of pulled out everything I loved about school and just kind of stomped on it. And I had a couple of tough years in middle school because one teacher in particular really was pretty negative. And that has always stuck with me as a teacher to say, like, I'm never going to be that teacher. But unfortunately, our children, my own children included, have encountered those teachers.
Mhm.
And I think that there are some important lessons. And I think one is we're never going to get along with everybody. It's just
Mhm.
never going to happen. We're never going to get along with all of our coworkers. We're not even going to get along with our own family members all the
Yeah.
time. And so having the value of talking with your child about adversity and what it means to actually be polite and civil and respectful with someone that you don't necessarily like or get along with, those are actually really important skills that the child might not recognize or appreciate today, but they will put into use years from now when they find themselves in other situations with people they don't like. So as parents, we want to take away anything we can that hurts our kids. I'm the same way with my own children. I mean, we would step in front of a bus for them. So we want to take that hurt away. But I caution parents from complaining too much about a teacher that they don't like, simply if the child doesn't like the teacher or doesn't connect with the teacher, because there are some very important like life lessons and soft skills that can be learned from that relationship. Now, the caveat to that is if the teacher is verbally abusive, if the teacher is assigning so much homework to the point where the child is drowning, if the teacher is treating the child so horribly or things like that, you go straight to administration. I'm a principal. I would want to know that. I would want to know if one of my teachers was not treating children with the dignity that they deserve. But just simply a personality conflict, or the teacher's a hard grader, or maybe she's not as loving as the parent might like, or maybe this one male teacher is tougher. We just sometimes kind of have to learn to not change ourselves, but we do have to learn how to pivot to be able to deal with different personalities. And the younger our children are, when they can sort of learn that soft skill, the better they're going to be at executive function, and the better they're going to be really at just their social relationships in general.
You spoke a lot about executive functions. So can you tell us about exactly what are executive functions and how do you help your kids develop them?
So executive function, and I won't say the word, I'll bleep myself, but it's basically, can you keep your blank together? And that word starts with an S. So it's like, can you keep it all together? And that's basically what executive function is. It's the ability for an individual to be able to monitor themselves and have personal responsibility and accountability for things. So for instance, as a teacher, an executive function skill would be, does the student have the materials he or she needs for class? And you always have that one student who they come trailing in with books and their pencils falling out and papers, and you open their locker and everything falls out. And that's that soft skill of executive function, of not being able to organize oneself. And so I think what parents of young children in particular can do is they can start actually giving their children responsibility at younger ages. So children as young as 3 years old can help with laundry. They can sort socks. They can start to fold. They can do things of that nature. Children that are 4 to 5 can make their own bed. It's never going to look as nice as maybe you want, but having them engage in that activity. Children as young as 3, 4, 5 can clean their own rooms. My favorite thing was I would either say to my kids, I bet that you can't clean your room by the time I count to 100. Well, every kid likes a competition. Or we'd put on their favorite song. Can we clean the room by the time your favorite song is over? And kids love to help and they want to be productive. And so when they start learning how to manage themselves at a younger age, they'll apply sort of that skill set as they move up. And so I'm like a huge fan of assigning chores and a huge fan of getting our kids to organize themselves. And so by assigning chores and by giving kids a little bit of freedom to make some choices on their own, gives them that soft skill of developing organization and time management. And those are things that we need moving on. And so executive function, we say, is like organization, time management, the ability to categorize things and sequence things. Executive function can also be arriving on time, things of that nature. And these would be particularly difficult, let's say, for students with learning differences, like children with ADHD, dyslexia, and some auditory processing issues. They will struggle a little bit more with executive function than others. But I will say is my youngest child is dyslexic. And he has amazing executive function. But part of that is my husband and I started when he was really young, was setting up consistent routines where he sort of learned how to engage in that behavior. And then by working with him on developing his sense of self through chores and personal responsibility. And now he's taken that. He's going into 8th grade. So he's about 13 or 14. I never check his homework. I never go to Google Classroom and check anything. I never check on his grades. He takes responsibility. And we say to him, these are our expectations. This is what we want. He's not perfect, but he knows what he needs to do. But that really was a lot of years of us working on those soft skills when he was younger. And so the more parents can do when the kids are younger to set them up, the more likely they will be to develop these skills later on. It's never too late. But the earlier you start, the more it's going to pay dividends later on.
Amazing. We're going to do that. I'm going to tell my husband this is the next step for us. So you mentioned some learning disabilities. What are some warning signs in children that will indicate that our children have learning disabilities?
So this is a great question. And what I did is I divided it into 3 different areas simply because there are many different types of learning differences that are out there. They're not all exactly the same. Yeah. And so the first one that I am going to just kind of touch on a little bit are some of the early warning signs for dyslexia. And I'm going to preface this by saying, if your child struggles with one of these things, that does not mean that your child will have a learning difference like dyslexia, but there are commonalities here. And when you add up a bunch of these different issues, many times this is what we see in students with dyslexia. And dyslexia is basically a language-based learning disability. There are types of dyslexia that have to do with math and math reasoning, but for the most part, dyslexia has to do with language-based learning disabilities, which has to do really with reading, spelling, and some other things having to do with sort of English language arts and with language acquisitions and phonics development. So some of those would be, so for children under 3, for instance, delayed speech. So many times children with that come to have dyslexia will have delayed speech. And most children will start to really speak somewhere between 2 and 3 years old, where they'll start to string together sentences. So up until about 2, you're not going to have an expectation. You might have a child that does that, but that's like saying if you've got a child who walks at 8 months, that can happen, but most kids are going to walk somewhere from about 10 to 14 months. And so delayed speech can be one of those. And so I would say delayed speech would be if you've hit 3 years old and your child continues to be extremely nonverbal, that might be something that you would take a look at. The other would be transposing words. And so that's kind of like messing them up. So it might be saying like communication instead of contamination, where they sort of have the same beginning sound, but they actually mean different things. And sometimes kids will get those wrong. They will have trouble naming things oftentimes when they're little. They're pointing at something and they know what it is, but they can't quite grasp the word. And sometimes students with dyslexia will have slow auditory and visual processing. And so that means that it's in there. It's just you and I are taking the freeway to get there and they're taking a side street. It just takes them a little bit longer to get to that information. Sometimes there are going to be struggles with rhyming, sequencing of events, and sometimes delayed fine motor skills. So sometimes, and I know in my son, something that we saw was that he switched between writing with his left and his right hand. And it wasn't until he went to formal school in kindergarten that he went right dominant. But my husband writes with his right hand. I am left-handed. And so he kind of went back and forth. And so what happens sometimes with dyslexics is they're firing all over the brain. And so what it is they're less efficient in certain tasks that they're trying to perform. And so that's why you might see a delay in some of the fine motor skills. Now, moving away, let's say from dyslexia, and if we go to something like auditory processing. So auditory is what someone is hearing. And so with auditory processing, some of the issues you might see are with what we call receptive language and expressive language. So receptive language is what you're hearing. Expressive language is what you're saying. And sometimes when a child has an auditory processing disorder, they're actually not hearing what you're saying. And so some kind of way to test that, even with children as young as 6 months old, 9 months old, is you could say, like, you could put things out on a table and you could say, oh, can you grab the ball for me? And the child's going to grab the ball. And so it would be kind of common vocabulary. And sometimes when kids get mixed up with that order, their receptive language might be impaired. Not all the time, but maybe. And then the same with expressive language. Sometimes what happens is they hear it correctly, but when it's in the brain, something gets scrambled. And when they express themselves, it doesn't align with necessarily what you said and what they heard. So that could be associated with an auditory processing disorder. And then the other one, which really isn't a learning difference, but I think is something that has come to the forefront, especially in the last probably 10 years, is attention deficit disorder. And that is when a student or a child has trouble attending. But there are different, I wouldn't say there's different types of ADHD. They all fall under the same umbrella, but there are different types. So you will have, especially in girls, they present far less with the hyperactivity. Girls can be hyperactive, but they're more likely to be what we would call inattentive. And that would be kind of their head is in the clouds and they're just kind of sort of off in a la la land. Whereas boys are more likely, not always, but more likely to present with hyperactivity. And so what happens sometimes with ADHD is we see connection between some other learning differences and ADHD. And I want to say, I don't have the exact number, but it may be as high as 75% of children who have, let's say, dyslexia might also have ADHD with it, but not all of the time. And ADHD is, I think, anytime a child is inattentive, the first thing, at least here in the United States, the parents say, it must be ADHD. No, not necessarily. Kids can just be inattentive because they're interested in something else. I mean, there are lots of things that can happen. But ADHD is going to be very persistent, where the child, no matter what types of behavioral modification are put into place, cannot control oneself. So there's going to be a lot of impulsivity, inattention, hyperactivity. And while that's not a learning difference in and of itself, it can definitely impede academic progress. And so anytime a child is being evaluated for a potential learning difference, the practitioner should be giving a secondary evaluation for ADD, ADHD. That should just come along with that.
I see. So mostly it's like sort of aloofness or inattentiveness and hyperactivity are the key things that I guess you would have to look for as a parent.
I would say that. And sometimes we have it's called task initiation, where sometimes children who are highly distractible have a hard time starting and following through with tasks. And so that sometimes can be an issue. But what I will say with young children in general, especially in today's society, perseverance is in grit, as they like to call it. Angela Duckworth is the mother of grit, and she has a great book called Grit, and it talks about how to help your children develop grit so that they can persevere through difficult times. And so young children aren't known for being able to persevere very long. It is something that we sort of have to work with them on. But I would say children with ADHD, they're really going to have a difficult time starting tasks and staying with them unless it is so highly engaging for them that then they get tunnel vision and they can't get off it at all. And you'll see that sway to the other way, where sometimes children with ADHD, they get locked into a singular focus and then you can't get them away from it.
I see. So it can go almost both ways.
It can. I caution parents of young children from trying to label them. And I would say that it's not until at least 6, if not a little bit older, where really truly you can assess a child for ADHD. There are some practitioners who will go down to age 4. I'm of the more conservative type that says, you know what, let's let kids be kids. We have a lot that's going on. And the longer that we can go from labeling that ADHD and working with them on behavioral modification, also sleep. A lot of young children, if they have sleep disruptions and they're sleep deprived, they will present with ADHD type symptoms that really come from sleep deprivation. And so I would encourage any parent to make sure that their practitioner, their pediatrician, whatever, is really doing a very thorough history on sleep and on nutrition before they just jump to that conclusion.
I see. That's very good, because I think a lot of parents really are, I guess, overparent or overly neurotic about what's going on with their kids. So it's good to, also for parents as well to sit back, think their thoughts.
Yes, we could probably all relax just a little bit. And now that I'm the mother of 2 teenagers, I can actually say that. It's okay. We can all relax a little bit. We don't have to worry about every little thing that happens with our kids. They're pretty resilient. They're going to do pretty well in life.
That's great. I mean, you as a parent of 2 kids, you're a principal, and you also have written a book, Answer Keys. Would you tell us about how it's different from other parenting books and what it's about?
I would be happy to. So Answer Keys came out of 3 colleagues of mine who are also moms, our conversations about all of our backgrounds as teachers, and how when we started to become parents, we found that we were naturally applying our own strategies that we were using for classroom management and other types of things in the classroom to our own kids. And we thought, gosh, we might kind of be onto something here. And so we worked for about a year, sort of looking at the research and reading up and looking at tons of other parenting books, and realizing that the research-based classroom management strategies we were using and other strategies really actually pertained really, really well to parenting. And we thought, gosh, I think we're onto something. And so at the time we wrote it, there were 4 of us. Our children ranged in age from basically 0 all the way up through, one of the moms had like a 17-year-old. And so we felt like among us, we had kind of a ton of kids, and we were like, let's really write this in lesson plan format in little standalone sort of lessons. Because a lot of parenting books, you feel like you've got to kind of read them from like beginning to end. Whereas ours, we wanted it for the mom in the carpool line that was like, okay, I've got time for like 10 minutes. And so you could pick out, it has 39 lessons in it. And they range from like creating a literacy rich environment to setting up a study station, to evaluating whether or not you might need to talk to someone if your child might have a learning difference. But each one is a standalone lesson, and it's based on research and then our own experiences with it. And it's written almost like a teacher would write a lesson plan. And so we wanted something that was easy, that parents could just implement in their own homes with tons of different suggestions, like if this doesn't work, try this. And then we have the research, in the footnotes. And if you are the type of person like I am that wants to read the research, you can do that. But for the most part, it's really like a hands-on sort of manual. And I think that a lot of parenting books are a lot of theory, whereas this was like boots on the ground. We've got parents who are freaking out and they just need something they can try today. And that was sort of why we wrote it. And that's sort of the feedback we've gotten about the book is just, okay, it's very practical and I can just put it into play today. And so that's been great feedback. We enjoyed that.
That's amazing. I'm sure lots of parents around the world are grabbing it up. I'm ready to grab it up right now. You actually learned a lot about early childhood education. Is that also something that you studied?
Yes. I mean, I think I'm like the world's oldest student. Like I just kind of perpetually go to school. So I was teaching the 3s, 4s, and 5-year-olds for a while. I taught kindergarten and first grade, 4th and 5th grade math, middle school language arts. So I've kind of taught all of those different grade levels just kind of over the years. But I think my particular interest is younger children. So basically like 14 and below, they just fascinate me. They absolutely fascinate me. And then raising my own children, and I have boys and girl, boy and a girl, just watching the differences has just been so interesting for me as a parent and as an educator to watch just who
Yeah.
they're developing into. And so I think, and I like to help parents of young children because I think it's a really difficult time. And again, I mean, you could go out to a million different places and get a million different messages. And I think it's hard for parents today, and they're under a microscope. And so if I could be helpful at all, that's really just what I want to do.
I'm actually really interested. I actually got really interested in early childhood education because my mom is actually an educator, and she's on the board of this organization called RNEC, the Asia Pacific Regional, like basically an early childhood network. And then she
Yeah.
did a conference when I was living in Beijing, and I interviewed 40 of the top early childhood development experts.
Yeah.
And it was just after learning about it, I thought that was just so interesting because I know you mentioned like, oh, there's the research. There's just so much to talk about in that research. So I noticed that like it was just like a concise thing, but like I got it. I was like, I know what you're talking about, but like that's another topic. It could take like forever to talk
Oh
about
my
that.
gosh. I used to do some conferences on this. And I mean, you could have a couple of days on this. And I mean, the brain-based research out there is just incredible. And it just makes me sort of sad that like more TV shows, like you look at like, at least here in America, like the Today Show and Good Morning America, and they don't spend enough time on this. They really don't. Oh,
Yes, they don't. I have to plug in my little baby.
oh God.
Yay.
Hello. Who is that?
This is Sasa.
Hi. Sasa. How old are you? Are you like 9 months, 6 months? How old are you?
Oh, she's only 3 months.
3
almost
months.
4.
She is so alert. Hi, baby.
Hi.
I can tell she's going to be a genius already.
Oh, I scared her. I do that sometimes. I'm sorry, honey.
So cute.
Yeah.
Oh, is she your first?
She's my second one.
Okay.
So I have one who is just under 3. She's like 2.5.
Okay. And how is she with the baby?
She's good. She's good. She loves the baby. And then this one is so curious about
Right.
the older sister. And then the older sister is always kissing the younger sister. But I can tell there's sometimes she's a little bit jealous.
Yep, that's very typical for that age group. But she's at a good age because it's right around 3 years where they kind of separate themselves and could see that the baby's not a threat. But the siblings that are much closer in age, oh yeah. I mean, you get an 18-month-old with a newborn, they're going to hit it all the time. Like they're going to hit the baby. Oh yeah, totally. Like that's like, I call it developmentally normal, but socially unacceptable.
Hi, Auntie Melissa. Hi.
So
Hi.
sweet. I barely remember mine at that age. Barely.
It just goes by so fast, right?
Oh my gosh, my daughter just got her driver's license 2 days ago, and I haven't seen her since. My husband and I are like, okay, she's in the car and she's gone. Like, it's crazy. And she'll be in college in 2 years, and I'm like, ah!
Oh my God. Yeah. I feel like it's like parenthood is just like one really slow, painful breakup.
It really is. And I don't know, do you know Tina Fey? Like, she's on all that stuff. She does this bit about like what it means to invite your own teenager to dinner. Oh my gosh, you have to like look it up on YouTube. It's the funniest thing I've ever seen. And it's just like all about how like your teenager just like doesn't have enough time for you and all this stuff. And it totally supports the whole breakup thing. It's just the funniest thing. She nails it. She absolutely nails it. And I just remember when my kids were little, there would be days when I was like, oh my gosh, like this is taking forever. And now my daughter's running out the door and I'm like, all I want is more time. And it's going, oh, look at his smiling. Look at that. She's so smiling. Look at that. Hi, baby. Yeah. So it's funny how I think they say the days are slow, but the years are fast. And that's exactly what it is. The days can be slow, but the years, then they just fly by.
Yeah. I really do. I just like, even just like the clothing, the cribs and everything is just like, she's already not fitting in her crib. She's supposed to be able to in it until she's 6 months. Like, but her feet are just like
Yeah.
almost poking out of that thing.
Just wait till they
She's like,
have their opinions about what to wear. Like my kids used to have the cutest little matching outfits, everything. And then all of a sudden one day they're like, yeah, no. And now they just, they have all these opinions. And I'm like, I just want you to wear these cute clothes that I bought for you. And my daughter doesn't want to wear anything I buy for her.
oh my gosh. I mean, we're already on that stage. Like my 2-year-old, she's like, I am wearing this today, okay? Tiger pants today. Only the tiger pants. Don't give me anything else. Like,
Yeah.
she's very, very opinionated, especially about her fashion. I'm just like, I think you're gonna be more fashionable than your mom. Like,
Yeah. And you know what I tell parents all the time? Let them go with it. I mean, my favorite thing when I was teaching early childhood would be the kid that came in the outfit that didn't match at all. And I was like, high five to that parent who's letting the child express individuality in a really positive way. So the throwing
Yeah.
of the tantrum is not good. That's not acceptable. We don't do that. But expressing yourself this way through, wearing what you wanted, don't fight that battle as a parent. Every
Yeah.
single teacher is going to applaud you for the kid that shows up wearing like yesterday's clothes because they wanted to. Whatever. Every teacher is going to say that parent's doing it right. That parent's giving that child some individuality. It's great that you're doing that.
So, how can our audience find you?
Well, I have a website, which I'd like to say is probably more, it's not as updated as it should be, but it's just Melissa Lowry educationcoaching.com. There's a little dash between every word. So it's like Melissa Lowry education coaching.com. And so that is my website, and you can reach me there. I have to admit, I'm not a big social media person, but my Instagram is Melissa Lowry EDU for education. So Melissa Lowry EDU at Instagram or whatever that is. I don't do too much on that.
Okay.
And then pretty much I'm just a principal, and I am the principal at Christ the King. It's a Catholic school in Atlanta, Georgia. And so if you go to christking.org, you can read about the school and you can read about me. And that's pretty much it.
Wonderful. And any last words you want to impart on our listeners today?
I just want to say to every parent that's out there, you can do this and you're better than you think you are. I think that our modern society tells working moms they're bad because they're working all the time. And then stay-at-home moms are bad because, they're not working. And you just can't get it right as a mom today. And I'm just here to say that there is no right way to be a mom. We love our children more than anything. We want them to be successful. And so, keep fighting the good fight. Raise your children the way that you know that you should. Seek help when you need it, but don't listen to the critics. If you're a stay-at-home mom, if you're a working mom, if you're a little of both, you're doing a great job out there, and not enough people tell you that.
Amazing. I love that. All right, guys. Thank you so much for being on the show. I learned so much today. Wonderful wealth of knowledge. And make sure you guys follow Kung Fu Mama Show at Kung Fu Mama Show at IG, Facebook, and we have a YouTube at Starring Sarah Chang. Thank you so much, Melissa, for being on the show. We had a blast.
The pleasure was all mine. Thank you so much.
Thank you.